This is Yesterzine, the literal magazine show. Every episode we take a magazine from the Golden Age, pass judgment over their best and worst rated titles, and see if the issue has anything to teach us about gaming when your game's magazines had more pages than some of the games had kilobytes. This episode closes the Amiga Power trilogy with the third great scandal of that storied magazine. Back in episode 7, we looked at issue 32 and the time they did not help the unfairly controversial cannon fodder with the ironic declaration,
"Old soldiers, I wish them all dead."
In episode 18, we dramatised the final issue of the magazine with reference to them being blacklisted by Team 17, mainly for saying that bad games were in fact bad games. In those cases, Amiga Power was absolutely on the moral high ground, if a little petulantly in the case of cannon fodder. But in this episode, they're simply the bad guys, and only a plea for mitigation is going to be available. Which is fine, because of course we all know they were all murdered in issue 65 anyway. And what is this issue, you ask? Well, it's number 42 from October 1994. Cover game Super Stardust is absolutely going to be a key piece of evidence later, but it's not our gaming heaven. That's cover disc game Theme Park on the fancy new Amiga 1200. The Hell is a game that's considered a classic on other formats, but that Amiga Power thought was worth a single figure percent. Twice. Interesting. But we've not got time for that now, because friend of the show and voice you heard 30 seconds ago, Shin, wants to go on Swarm 16 times in a row, so we'd better get moving. The Tycoon game. First made popular, at least for me, by Microprose and Sid Meier. Railroad Tycoon was a mainstay of my early gaming on the PC. I have vivid recollections of playing an entire game of Civilization in one sitting during the summer holidays. It took 8 hours. And everyone knows SimCity. As a genre, it exploded, and it's still going strong today, even on console. If you have an Xbox or PS4, you could play City Skylines, 2 Point Hospital, or, as of very recently, Planet Coaster. And all three of these owe their lineages to older games. City Skylines devs were responsible for the Cities in Motion series, and their publisher Paradox has been making strategy games for 20 years now. 2 Point Hospital is a direct descendant of the original Theme Hospital from Bullfrog, developer 2 Point even including a lot of the ex-Bullfrog staff. Planet Coaster is Frontier, who were also the developers behind Roller Coaster Tycoon. But Roller Coaster Tycoon only existed because of the predecessor to Theme Hospital, one of Bullfrog's most famous titles, and one that, while not being first, set a light-hearted tonal precedent that a lot of these games follow to this day. Theme Park. And as the surprisingly impressive intro that fills 2 of the game's 4 discs plays, let me explain why this, the highest scorer of the issue, is interesting to me. Because I love my Tycoon games, always have, but modern ones have a nasty tendency to be simply more complex than I'm looking for when I'm trying to relax. Too many things to keep track of, too much hard thought. Even Planet Coaster I stopped playing at one especially nasty mission where it seemed impossible to balance everything to make money and I just wanted to build cool rides. But I've not played Theme Park since it was current, and I had the PC version. This is one of those times where, has it aged, is personal. One place where it hasn't aged is, while it's a 4-disc game, it'll at least support 3 extra drives, so you won't be doing any swapping if you're on an emulator now, or rich then. There's a lot of tuning options too, all of which are general since the game still has missions. The idea is to build a worldwide empire of theme parks across the countries, starting, predictably, with the UK. And it works you in easy, starting with a restricted number of rides, shops and staff. As mentioned, this is the Amiga 1200 version, which led the A500 version by a couple of months, so we're running this on the more powerful consumer Amiga. You do feel, especially in these early stages, just how simple it is compared to a modern game. I've got about 4 rides and a few shops to deal with, as well as a smattering of scenery. It's quite an easy thing to manage at this stage. You absolutely have the cash to buy one of each, and you will need to in order to hit your targets. The rides are nice. Each have at least some sort of animation of them running, and for the time, combined with the individually named people, it does very quickly give you a lovely sense of a living, breathing park you created, And ultimately for me that's the joy of any game like this. It's the reason Minecraft 2 is so successful, a kind of digital Lego attraction, building something and seeing your own creation. And when there's a life to it, like in Railroad Tycoon or here, even more so. It all works perfectly well, and you remember Theme Park's little touches, like being able to up the salt in fries and caffeine in coffee to achieve the obvious aims, and the sheer personality Bullfrog managed to infuse into relatively tiny characters of the mechanics and entertainers. Some things don't work so well early on. I had a very simple park, but still my handymen were clustering in one part of it, ignoring huge piles of trash elsewhere. This being an old game, one of the quality of life features missing is the ability to micromanage this. You can't pick up and move staff in order to fix these issues. Also, you don't get proper food shops until year 3 of the default beginner park, but people will still complain they're hungry. While I get it, it's just not good practice for the game to bother you with something you just don't have the ability to fix. These are all just old game things, to be honest, and not majorly harmful if you're careful where you first put your staff when you employ them, since the concept of staff rooms and rest areas are not in these things. Theme Park still plays a good and relatively simple game, even when you unlock the few customisable rides like the water ones and of course the roller coasters. We're playing on the lower levels here, and I think that's the way to go. Higher levels leave you to directly micromanage store stock levels and staff wages, which is probably one too many things, especially given the 90s interface. Theme Park, though, is still worth playing. This version, though, may not be the one. That 90s interface is really, really slow and unresponsive. It's not as intuitive as a modern game, we get that, but it's the responsiveness that gets you. Laying paths sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, and anything you click on may or may not respond as you would wish it to. What worries me is, this is obviously the first park, and quite a small one. If this is something that gets worse in this game, it's going to be near impossible by the end stages. It really feels like this game might be a little bit beyond an A1200, and I tried 2 completely separate releases to prove it wasn't a crack issue. I dread to think what the A500 version might have ended up with. So in full research, let's throw some more CPU cycles at it, with the PC version. In this case, the version sold cheaply on GOG. And immediately this is the game I was expecting from the A1200 version. It's quicker, allowing the extra speed only available on very quick Amigas, and the interface is perfectly smooth. Almost too perfectly smooth, since I kept shooting off sideways trying to lay paths. Nonetheless, this is the one you should play. That's interesting though, because if we're opening this up to what can you do with a modern PC, why shouldn't we have a bloody A4000? And the answer is because both my versions of it crash on an emulated A4000. Never mind. The conclusion is pretty clear. If you're an emulator gamer, pick up that PC version. But if what you have is an Amiga 1200, Theme Park is still lovely. If you're the kind of person that would have played it on full sim, then maybe a newer, more complex game like Parkitect or Planet Coaster is for you. But if you're me and just want to noodle with a park, it's as charming and fun as ever. Amiga Power had what the publishers insisted they call the Amiga Power Policy of Truth. It went thusly.
We won't review unfinished games just to claim an exclusive. We don't pander to games publishers. We say what we really think. We only use experienced professional reviewers. We won't bore you with mountains of technical jargon, hardware tedium. We take games seriously because you do too.
It's the first one we need to look at here. As often with Amiga Power, we lean heavily on their old retrospective site AP2. And as they do, we define our terms. Because when we say finished game, we don't quite mean finished. If you've ever had a promotional copy of a game, you'll know they don't always look the same as a retail one. From my brief time in the games industry, here are some of my PS2 promos, for example. Originally, they came in the kind of little jewel case you might remember CD singles coming in. And as you can see, you're not mistaking them for a real game. They are, though, almost always identical disc contents to those in the shops. Minus, perhaps in modern times, a day one patch, for the obvious reason you'll be reviewing them before release. AP2 point out some other minor caveats. Adventure Game Universe ended up being reviewed twice for AP, after the editor rejected a "if you like that sort of thing, you'll like this" review from a freelancer. Unfortunately, this meant he missed the note from the publisher that it was an Amiga 500 version, not the Amiga 1200 one they were expecting, and that the music was a placeholder. No biggie, although Future's rep signing Jay Nash's name on a letter of apology he hadn't been told about went down poorly at best. A couple of other times, publishers actually pulled games in order to change things Amiga Power spotted. AP2 gives the example of fixing the running in the excellent Lionheart, and an incredibly obscure bug they tripped over in Flight of the Amazon Queen. There are also the rare occasions like Putty Squad a month before this, where the game was absolutely finished. It was worth 91%. It was ready to go. It was on the cover. It wasn't released. The perils of a machine on the down, I guess. The game did actually eventually get released on the Amiga, in 2013 alongside the PlayStation 4 version. We're not talking about any of these scenarios. We're talking about making a final review of a game fundamentally incomplete and missing important features. Other magazines certainly did this. The most famous example I know being Microprose's Subwar 2050, where Amiga Action absolutely and transparently reviewed a finished version. The finished PC version, on a machine many times the power of the Amiga, and they used screenshots that proved it. And given you've just been here for the theme park review, you know what difference that can make. We've not got time for the crimes of Amiga Action here though. I'll write that down for next year. Possibly all of next year. We're talking about Amiga Power. 4 months before this, in issue 39, editor Jonathan Davies wrote the following in response to reviewing a not quite final version of Arcade Pool because Team 17 sent the wrong disc.
Fear not, readers. Amiga Power is committed to reviewing only finished, fully tested versions of games. Steps are being taken as you read this to ensure that nothing like this happens again.
6 months after this, in issue 48, editor Jonathan Davies wrote the following.
All magazines review unfinished games from time to time.
Alright, time to finish beating about the bush. In the 3 months, starting with this issue, Amiga Power reviewed 3 entirely unfinished games in as many months. What happened? The first game is this, Super Stardust, an Asteroids clone and Amiga 1200 sequel to the excellent A500 game Stardust. If you've owned a Sony console in the last 15 years, you might remember Super Stardust HD on PlayStation 3, Portable on PSP, Delta on Vita, or Ultra on PS4. These are indeed new versions of the game from the same developer Housemarque, currently working on the wonderful looking Returnal for PS5. And this is where Housemarque, then known as Bloodhouse, started. Stardust and Super Stardust were their first game. And it's still great. Twin-stick controls added a lot to this as a genre, but with these old school controls, this is easily the single best version of Asteroids you can play, and the quickfire levels system make it interesting and arcade with always something new to do. I can see why Nash thought it might be too easy for seasoned gamers though, apparently an overreaction to the original being rock hard. If Bobbin's Old Me is doing perfectly well across the whole of the first world sight unseen, then his ability to storm through as much as he did makes perfect sense. What we don't know, of course, is how well he would have coped with the finished version. Because you've seen a lot of what AP did already. Super Stardust has 5 worlds. The version Amiga Power reviewed had 3. If you read the review carefully, you can actually figure this out, as Jay Nash was, to put it mildly, unhappy about being asked to review it unfinished. In fact, the only reason you have to read the review carefully is because whoever typeset it largely decided that the easiest to read colour scheme is white on white. But there are clues, the most obvious being the section headers in the review, which read in order, finished, 60%, only. Yeah. He also makes references to completing level 3, that you should have no trouble getting to level 3 on the first day, and that he sailed through the first 60% of the game and hoped to return later. So what's the defence on this one? Well, Stardust was supposed to be in issue 41, but right at the last moment they were told it wouldn't make it. But that obviously meant it should be there in plenty of time for 42. They went large, hence the rather lovely cover with bespoke art. They were promised a demo on a rarely seen third cover disc. They were ready. But of course the game wasn't. Changing the cover was impossible too. There wasn't time for bespoke art, and the other two big games of the month had already got generic covers on the other magazines. It might not be a great excuse. They could have transitioned it to an extensive preview, for example. But it's what they did. They reviewed Stardust and gave it the same 89% they gave the original version. Team 17, acting as publisher for Stardust, dug up an Alien Breed demo for the third disc to fill that hole. Stardust was a safe bet, of course. It was really just a remaster. The next month, not so much. Yesterzine viewers, especially those who were smart enough to watch the two previous parts of the Amiga Power trilogy, will need no introduction here. If you do need one, go back and watch episode 7, where we look at Pinball Illusions developer Digital Illusions and their incredibly different beginning, and even more incredibly different current incarnation. Short version though, Pinball Fantasies, and specifically its main table Partyland, are my favourite pinball game of all time. This is the sequel, Pinball Illusions. It's a little tight in only having 3 tables instead of the 4 in both its predecessors, but virtually everything I said about Pinball Fantasies applies here, only slightly prettier. More specifically, you're looking at the Law and Justice table. When Amiga Power reviewed Pinball Illusions in issue 43, it's the only table that was finished. But again, it was the cover. Again, they had a demo, unsurprisingly, of Law and Justice. Davies stepped up as editor and took the responsibility of writing the review, and included very few clues as to the criminal deception, merely mentioning he thought Law and Justice was the best one, on the way to awarding another 89%. They talk about playing the other 2 tables less, unsurprising as they're not quite finished, and the picture of extreme sport is conspicuously missing a lot of the detail in the final game. Nonetheless, as with Stardust, you can't disagree with that score. Illusions was the last of the games Digital Illusions did direct, and it's absolutely on a par with Dreams and Fantasies. It got a PlayStation release if you're interested, True Pinball, and, neatly fulfilling what seems like the obligatory mention of Ocean every episode this series, they published that one. When they reached shops, of course, both Super Stardust and Pinball Illusions were complete, working, and every bit as good as built. Amiga Power would have got away with the whole thing and never mentioned it again, if it wasn't for issue 44.
You're a gold starring superstar hero. You let your head down and play to the band. You're a gold starring superstar hero. And every go, the double best around.
I'm not even going to bother talking much about the game itself here. It's Sensi. It's perhaps the greatest version of Sensi. There's a very good argument for it being the best Amiga game ever released. The original Sensible Soccer itself appeared on Mega Drive back in episode 3 of this series, and it hasn't aged a day on Mega Drive, or on Amiga, or, since we're talking about it, the astoundingly good Master System version, which is so far past any other 8-bit football game it's not even in the same division. The problem is, though, Sensible World of Soccer wasn't finished. With the game being released on the 27th of November, and AP44 being released on the 17th, and of course written at least 2 weeks earlier, they had to either review a slightly early version of the most anticipated Amiga game ever, or Review it 3 weeks after everyone inevitably bought it. They reviewed it. They got the very latest version possible, which is another issue, because it was delivered by a Sensible Software representative personally. A Sensible Software representative called Stuart Campbell. Ex-Amiga Power editor Stuart Campbell, in fact. Stuart, among his other qualities, such as thinking many of my friends don't have a right to exist, is a football fan. As with Pinball Illusions, Jonathan Davies insisted on reviewing the game himself rather than making someone else do it. Jonathan Davies is not a football fan. This meant that despite Stuart directing him to an extent we can't possibly know, but AP2 insist was not material to the review, he simply didn't give the game as much of an in-depth analysis, skirting over some football-specific features and being woolly on control changes and difficulty balance issues that others might have spotted. There were bugs too, including ones that allowed you to leave a red-carded player on the pitch, ones that massively boosted stats of substitutes, and one that allowed you to get your job back immediately after being fired in management mode, among others. And also, one where you can press M to get £1,000,000, which was unfortunate for the person that wrote into Amiga Power to report that one, because it's only present in pre-release copies leaked to pirate groups. Awkward. The others, though, Amiga Power were assured would be fixed. They were not. The game shipped essentially exactly as AP reviewed it. People noticed. A lot of people noticed. Amiga Power were thoroughly busted. The quote about unfinished games came from a mea culpa column 4 months later, where Sensible answered readers' questions about the bugs in probably way too flippant a tone than was warranted. Sensible did though admit they had to get it out for Christmas and simply ran out of time. To their credit, the publisher stepped up and funded an update disc, an early example of a post-release patch, which was sent automatically to all registered owners, and also promised for the cover of Amiga Power 50. It wasn't on the cover of Amiga Power 50, or any subsequent issue as far as I can tell, a fitting end to this tale, but at least Amiga Power came to their senses and never committed one of these crimes again. They were lucky. All 3 of these games were excellent, and in patched or updated 95-96 mode, Sensible Soccer remains a candidate for the greatest Amiga game ever. But ultimately, that was pure luck really, especially with Illusions, where they were reviewing a third of a game. From there though, we go to a game where a third might be entirely too much. Battletoads! A famous 80s TV cartoon about which I know absolutely nothing. Battletoads! A famous early 90s NES game about which I know absolutely nothing. Battletoads, a less famous, less early 90s Amiga game about which I know absolutely nothing. This is going to go well. So what do we know? Well, first we know this is the lowest scoring game in this issue of Amiga Power. And finished or not, they said,
if it gets 10%, it ought to count itself extremely lucky.
Before giving it 9%, the wacky funsters that they are. Secondly, we know the NES game is incredibly highly regarded, considered an all-time classic, if a rock-hard one. We also know, though, that it was 3 years old at this point, and obviously initially developed for a console with a fraction of the Amiga's power. Thirdly, we know Mindscape didn't bother sending Amiga Power a review copy. They discovered it had crawled out when they found a copy for half the already low for the time £20 retail price in their local games emporium. If Wikipedia is to be believed, when I went to check they were supposed to be the same game, the Amiga version sat on the shelf at the publisher for 2 years before they bothered releasing it. Fourthly, we apparently know from this intro that the Toads are called Pimple, who has been kidnapped, Rash and Zitz. Working from the mature end of the spectrum for this one then. And finally, we know that despite this being a 1MB Amiga game, released at the same time as some of the absolute gold you've seen this episode, you have to choose between sound effects and music because making the Amiga do 2 things is apparently some sort of major witchcraft. I went for sound effects. mainly because to change to music would have involved plugging a keyboard in. It's a rule of any review that you don't put in any more effort than the people who made the damn game did. Starting the game, we find what immediately appears to be a side-scrolling beat-em-up. A little bit lazy, but nothing wrong with that. What is wrong, and there's no point waiting to point it out, is this is a one-button joystick game. That button controls jump and punching. You have little control over which one happens. Broadly, if you're moving, it's going to jump, but that doesn't seem universal at all, and of course, when engaged in a bout of fisticuffs, you do occasionally want to move. Thankfully, the AI also has the intelligence of a not especially smart rock, and will happily line up in order to receive their serving of fist in face like it's the school canteen. We can give it a couple of things. If you recall the Captain America game a couple of episodes ago, one of the big issues with that is it was almost impossible to position yourself in the right vertical place to actually connect with an enemy. That's not a problem here. Battletoads is generous with this almost to a fault. It also responds well. The jump you didn't mean to do happens instantly and smoothly on a button press. It's dull though. We fought through quite a lot of basically the same enemy so far, and the lack of music really saps the atmosphere. I suspect the other way round wouldn't be a lot better. Not hearing punches connect would be really confusing in a game like this. Given that there are many Master System beat-em-ups that can do music and sound effects together, it's a bit pathetic really. And then there's this bastard. A flying enemy where there's a 50-50 chance of a punch connecting, or you just being picked up and thrown around the level. And when I beat him, there's no actual indication I did so. You'd think you'd at least get a scream from a cheap sound effects library or something. It's not like it's going to interrupt the awesome music. So, with nowhere visible to go, we drop down to presumably the next level. And die. Wonderful. We crawl our way back there and assume there must be some idiotic blind jump involved here. Okay, contextual jump punch, don't fail me now. Crap. I go and have a dignified contemplation of the situation. Third try. Crap. Nope. Done. Not least because I'm more than bored of spending 5 minutes fighting through idiots to get a single jump in. That's more your mum's thing. The Amiga Power review suggests there's some variety after this, with a couple of shoot-em-up-like levels part of the 12 in the full game. But they think they're all terrible as well, and nothing in me wants to find out. What I do want to do, though, is go and look at that NES game, because it cannot be this bad. I'm very much a Master System man, but that's not going to deny that both the NES and Rare were capable of excellent games and frequently produced them. Do not tell me in the second half of the NES's life this crap was considered excellent. Oh no, now I get it. There's music and sound. The enemies have much more fluid movement. The whole game is quicker. The AI is smarter. The level design is subtly different but works much better. I've got more moves. The main character has a personality entirely missing on the Amiga. And praise be, jump and thump are 2 different buttons. And as for that jump, yeah, it's still blind, but it's also easily doable, 2 buttons or not. This still isn't really my type of game, and we're running low on time, so let's not go fully into it here. It's not the point. But there's an atmosphere, imagination and control entirely missing from the version for a machine that should have crushed it. It's insane. If this is your kind of game and you've somehow not played this, try that NES original. It's a damn good effort on the machine and so far ahead of that Amiga attempt. I don't even know what to add. On the back page is Quantum Sheep, an independent maker of fine ZX Spectrum games at prices that make 1980s Mastertronic look like money-grabbing scumbags. As fans of the KLF, we're especially fond of Last Train to Trans Central, a lovely little platform shooter with music the KLF would probably appreciate. At these prices though, you can't possibly go wrong. Find the collection at quantumsheep.itch.io and tell them we sent you on Twitter at quantum_sheep. And that's us for another series. But don't fret, you might just see this show back sooner than you think. In the meantime though, do go back and enjoy those other 23 episodes, including the other 2 in the Amiga Power trilogy. If you watch this anytime remotely near its original posting, have a survivable Christmas, and stay tuned to this channel for a couple of things that might help with that. Until then, toodaloo.